Hey guys, welcome back to another video. So today's video, I am going to be showing you guys kind of like my rendering process from kind of like what my art looks like on the left hand side versus what it looks like on the right hand side. So on the left, I have only the rough coloring or what I consider the rough coloring alongside with my sketch. And then the one on the right is obviously the finished illustration. So while I go through a quick time lapse of how I got to the point of, I guess like right before I start to actually do the rendering for this particular drawing, the idea of like rendering, or at least like when I was back in uni, we were taught that rendering isn't like particularly a specific technique. It's more of like a process of getting your artwork or whatever you're working on to a level of finish. And that level of finish is going to vary from person to person based on like preferences, whatever you're kind of like looking for the final product, I guess. So for me, starting off with our kind of like coloring portion pretty much finished, I'm going to be showing what my sketch looks like if I take it off of the multiply layer, because I think a lot of people are a little bit confused about what the multiply layer typically does, and I don't really know how to explain it, so I'm just going to show you guys. This kind of like dark purple color, what I currently have set to like on a normal layer, is what I like to typically use when I sketch just like on a plain canvas. But because the color is fairly dark, when I do set it to multiply, it doesn't really seem to change all that much. So just to briefly demonstrate, I am going to revert my sketch back to a normal layer, and then I'm going to go into our sliders right here and make my sketch very, very light and very kind of like more of a muted pinkish purple color. But then I'm going to switch it to multiply so you can kind of see what effect it takes in comparison to what the normal layer looks like. It kind of appears a little bit softer because I did choose a color that is a little bit on the lighter side and nothing too intense, because I do find that multiply tends to boost the saturation as well as it makes the color a lot darker. While screen I find kind of does the opposite. So it kind of mutes the color a little bit and it makes things a lot brighter. So you can use that to your advantage. Just play around with blend modes to see what they actually do and see if you can incorporate it into your work if you feel like it's kind of needed. But at this point, I do manually change certain areas to match the colors a little bit, I don't know, to a more suitable color. So more recently, I like changing my lines to be much more pale and not as bold. So it makes it a little bit easier for me to boost the contrast a little bit later. So once I think I'm kind of finished changing some of the line colors, I am going to be kind of merging that sketch layer directly on top of my colored layer. Now you don't really have to do this, but this is just how I prefer to work on Procreate, to kind of like do a little bit of layer management and less of like back and forth switching. But I did end up merging my sketch layer, which is on a multiply blend mode, down to my kind of like rough colors. So now they're all just on one layer. And then after that, I will then layer clip any of other blend modes to kind of adjust the colors before we actually start rendering. So at this point, sometimes I fiddle with the lighting. If I want to add extra highlights, anything to glow, anything like that, then I will add it at this point. You can also do this at the very end. I don't know why I prefer to do it like this. I definitely think it would be easier for myself if I did those effects at the very end on like a more polished illustration, rather than having to fiddle around with trying to keep that effect going while I'm doing the rendering and cleaning up process. But after that, I end up merging all of my layers down to that same kind of first merged layer of my sketch and my rough coloring. And then we can start with the rendering. So for me, there's kind of like three things I like to focus on when it comes to rendering. So one is making my lines sharper and darker for contrast, as well as cleanup, which I find that sometimes my sketch lines are not super clean before I merge, so I do have to get rid of some of those stray lines. And then last but not least, I like to focus on adding detail or fleshing things out, which I feel like sometimes is what a lot of people tend to focus on when it comes to rendering. So sometimes you might have like a very basic looking let's say an orb or a sphere, and maybe you want to add like texture at this point, or maybe you want to fix the shading, or like, I don't know, something of that sort. So at that point, that's what I would do during the rendering process for at least myself. Obviously, other people will have different methods or approaches to how they end up with their finished illustration, and that would be considered like their rendering process. So for me, right away, I've opened up kind of like the reference window in Procreate, and I've kind of like zoomed in on Danheng's face. By the way, I don't think I really mentioned, I am doing an illustration of Danheng right now. So this is a character from Honkai Star Rail, and I've been drawing him a lot recently, as a lot of you guys know. But this one, I just needed motivation to like really push and finish it, which is why I wanted to take you guys along with me doing the rendering, because I was a little bit afraid that I was not going to like this piece at the very end. But now that I've completed it, I'm very happy with it. And hopefully in the future, I'll show you guys what I'm doing with this particular illustration. Let's kind of like talk a little bit more about like the rendering process once again, or at least like my rendering process. So the first 2 points that I made, which is like kind of like cleaning up as well as adding contrast and keeping my lines or like things to look a little bit sharper. So oftentimes I am kind of like, I sketch with a particular brush, I rough color with a particular brush, and then when I'm doing the rendering, I kind of stick to one brush. So I almost use one brush per step in my drawing process, I guess. So because of the brush that I like to use, as well as just like the size of it or just how messy I am, sometimes the lines are a little bit more fuzzy or soft or a little bit blurry, or even like at some points, or even right here, they're on the thicker side. And sometimes I don't really want like a super thick outline. It makes things look a little bit more flat, or maybe doesn't read, I don't know, the way that you want it to, or maybe it's even too much like attention being drawn to it because it has an outline around it rather than just it being like some sort of flat color. So for me, at least, when I switch brushes doing kind of like the rendering process, I do use the Sharp Render brush from Jing Sketches' brush pack. I don't really remember if I changed settings. I probably did. I'm pretty sure I have a video talking about the brushes that I've used and kind of like how I've changed certain like aspects of them so that they fit my needs. So I highly recommend that you fiddle around with the settings and figuring out what works for you, because I've talked about this in the past as well, that like my pressure sensitivity is not going to be the same or wouldn't work for everybody, as well as like naturally how hard you press on the screen also, or like your own drawing habits are going to differ from your own preferences and stuff, especially like from other artists. Even though it's like it's very good to try like other people's settings and stuff, because maybe, you know, they do happen to match your preferences, and then it makes things a little bit easier for yourself. But I highly recommend that if you feel like you're stuck, or if you don't like the brush that you're using, just start experimenting, start playing around and see what sticks, as well as like learning what certain settings do. Then you can later on maybe make a brush that you like or know how to adjust it so that it fits better to your needs. But the clean up and like sharpening things and adding contrast, I do this more often, especially kind of like around the face and the hair. So oftentimes, especially for like hair, because they kind of have like a triangular shape. Obviously, this will depend on the hair type, as well as like how you like to draw the hair and how you maybe like put it into chunks or whatever. But oftentimes, like whenever they kind of like create a V shape, I guess. So the inside of the V, I would darken up so that it adds a little bit more of that thickness, a little bit of contrast, a little bit of more like depth in a way, or at least like you're trying to mimic like line weight variation, which helps things look a little bit less flat. It helps kind of like things look a little bit more, have a sense of depth, like I mentioned earlier. So because of that, I like to have any lines that kind of like come to a V shape, I like to darken. And then anything that comes to like a point, I like to thin out, because I don't want kind of like my lines to look too. But there's like nothing wrong with having very uniform lines. I just find, at least for myself, that oftentimes if I'm lazy and I start making things have the same line width across like outlining or anything, it does flatten things quite a bit. So I'll try my best to either change the color of my lines so that at least visually there's some difference, or I will, change the line thickness instead. So I do that a lot, especially like doing objects or like I said, around the face, around the hair. And as I'm kind of like sharpening up a lot of my sketch lines, I'm also erasing or adding in colors to kind of clean up any stray lines here and there, any of the messy coloring that I did when I initially put down the colors for like the entire form or whatever I was working on at the time. And then the last thing I talked about was the idea of adding details. Now, my approach with adding details is very much, I feel like it's a little bit less painterly because I do go with a very small brush and I treat it almost the same way as I treat dry mediums. So I'm like slowly building up by doing back and forth almost, like kind of like strokes or like that kind of a method, and building up value slowly. So I do like using the sharp render brush because it's not blurring anything. I can control kind of the opacity almost, or the translucency, whatever you want to call it, how dark or how much color I'm laying down with just like the pressure sensitivity of my hand. So I like being able to vary that as much as I can. Now, I know that my approach to making my illustrations look more finished and clean is not going to be suitable for everyone, as well as I don't really recommend it if you're somebody who wants to work very fast. I find that if you had either like line art or a very clean sketch that you don't have to alter the lines too much, then you wouldn't really need to like do the same method of me merging and then almost redoing the lines like over and over again. For some reason, I've taken this approach to doing kind of like to kind of like finish my artwork for whatever reason, but I also enjoy this process. I find this rendering process, at least for me, more therapeutic. I'm just like finishing it up. I can choose whenever I want to technically to stop, or if I do want to only, let's say, do a little bit more of like minimal rendering versus like going more hardcore, which I feel like at least this one of Dan Hung, I am putting a little bit more effort because I do have expectations of really wanting to have this piece be a little bit more detailed and having it be at a finish that doesn't have like too many straight lines. I want the color application and all that stuff to be much more clean and crisp and hopefully not like too incorrect looking, I guess. I should have also prefaced this video. Maybe I'll put at the very beginning with text, but this is by no means a tutorial. I just wanted to show you guys and explain a little bit more about the rendering process because I find more recently my beginning of rendering and my end of rendering has much more of a dramatic look more recently because I've changed how I colored my sketch prior to merging. Like I mentioned earlier, that I like keeping my lines much more on the lighter side and a little bit more faint, so it gives me more opportunity for myself to kind of like pick and choose which lines I really want to darken or which ones I want to give more focus to. So for me, it's a little bit more fun that way, but I noticed that, some people might be like, whoa, like it might be a very drastic difference for some people, I guess. And I do believe that rendering does take me the longest out of like any of the steps, like compared to sketching, which tends to go kind of like the fastest, and then rough coloring or like coloring of the entire figure or whatever I'm drawing takes probably the second longest, and then obviously the longest one that would be rendering because I spend way too much time just going back and forth. And sometimes if I'm not like putting my full attention on the artwork, which oftentimes I'm not at the rendering phase, I kind of like tune out a little bit. I do sometimes just go back and forth. And then once I take my eyes off of like one section, sometimes I'll come back to it and not like it. So I'll keep adding to it. So it's a lot of back and forth at that point too. Also at this point, I ended up not showing too much of the rendering because it's a lot of like repetitive stuff. So if you guys are interested in seeing more of my rendering process in real time, a lot of my start to finish videos does have the full length process of me going through the entire rendering stage. So if you want to watch that at your leisure, you definitely can, or you can kind of see me go back and forth or make the choices that I do make in any of those types of videos. Same goes for like sketching or like what I consider the rough coloring, effects, certain backgrounds and stuff. I do have like start to finish videos that kind of like show that process. So I ended up kind of like speeding through as well, adding a little bit more lighting and foreground elements to this to kind of like help finish off the piece. Last thing I did was duplicate basically the finished illustration 3 times or twice so that I had 3 copies, and then Gaussian blurred them at different intensities and then slowly erased it to kind of bring focus to just basically his face area. And the last step that I do, not every time, but oftentimes for like anything that has more like a scenery or background involved, I will try my best to adjust the colors one last time at the very end. So you can kind of see that around the edges, I'm adding more of blue to the background and anywhere that's like not near his face. And then I'm going in with like a lighter orange and gradually adding a little bit more warmth there so that I can slowly adjust the colors very slightly. And then I'll lower the opacity and keep checking whether or not my colors look better with or without, and then I'll try to find a middle ground. If not, I can also just like totally scrap it at the very end as well. But I think I left it fairly light. I did like the intensity of the blue, so that's what I ended up with for this particular illustration. And Danhung is done. I did end up cutting a lot of the footage down because, like I said, it was a little bit monotonous of me going back and forth doing the rendering process. And I just really needed to finish this illustration as fast as I could to like a reasonable degree because I spent way too long on this. Maybe because I was not like certainly sold, I guess, or totally sold on the composition. But at the very end, I do like what he looks like. I think it looks very pretty. So hopefully you guys enjoyed watching the process a little bit here and there, as well as hearing my thoughts about rendering and what I like to do. And yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!